The rumors surrounding bus route. 13. It's the kind of story that drifts between whispers at dimly lit diners or emerges in the quiet hours of a local dive bar in New York. You know the type, urban legends that settle in among gritty city folklore. In this case, the tale revolves around the notorious bus route 13. Not your standard late-night bus, this line only seems to appear at unearthly hours, and even then, only in the eeriest, most desolate parts of the city, where the cold fog rolls in thick, and the streetlights flicker like they're on the verge of giving up. Locals have their theories, as they always do. Some say Bus 13 operates in secret, exclusively for passengers who have no other way to leave their troubles behind, literally. Others insist it never existed officially, and that the city's transit archives contain no record of such a route. "But I've seen it," someone would swear, hushed yet insistent, their voice tinged with both fear and conviction. Always at night, always when you're absolutely sure you're alone in the world. Witnesses, or those who claim to be, describe its approach as otherworldly. The sound of tires crunching broken glass echoes unnaturally loud in the empty streets as the bus pulls up. Its headlights don't pierce the darkness so much as they absorb it, casting a peculiar gray haze in their wake. No one can seem to remember the exact moment it arrives. One second there's only silence and the vacant stretch of road, the next Route 13 is looming in front of them like it's materialized out of nowhere. Even more curious is the bus itself. Witnesses consistently recall a vehicle that looks weathered, like it belongs to another era entirely. Its paint is faded, almost unrecognizable, with streaks of rust crawling along the edges of its frame. While every bus in the city boasts a vibrant modern number display, Route 13's signage is a dim and almost illegible glow, flickering faintly as if powered by some barely functioning circuit. And the doors? They creak open so slowly it's as if the bus is reluctant to let anyone step inside. Where it goes no one can really agree. Some say it never has an endpoint, simply looping endlessly like a purgatorial riding experience for the lost. Others whisper about final stops in overlooked neighborhoods, ones erased or left unexplored on city maps. Abandoned factories, derelict piers, or empty lots shrouded with a chilling secrecy. But without a doubt, what sets this legend apart is the people, or rather, the lack of people. Most who have encountered Bus 13 describe it as strangely quiet, eerily devoid of the lively chaos that usually defines New York's transit system. There are no arguing couples or musicians busking with broken guitars. Instead, those who've dared to board report a spine-chilling atmosphere where the seats are often occupied by shadowy, unmoving figures, their faces concealed in the gloom. Are they commuters trapped in time? Are they even human? No one knows for certain, but the sense of unease blankets the cabin like a shroud. To this day, the tales of Bus Route 13 remain a topic of controversy. It's a mystery that's been passed down over decades, surviving in the spaces where boredom births imagination and genuine fear takes root. No hard evidence has ever been captured, no definitive photos, no GPS records. But for every skeptic shaking their head, there's another New Yorker catching fleeting glimpses of silver-gray metal disappearing into the night and feeling the chills prickling up their spine. Ask someone about it. They'll laugh, roll their eyes and call it nonsense, but then the tone shifts, slowly, carefully. "Well," they might murmur, "my cousin's buddy swears his uncle saw it once, right over in Red Hook, late night, just before the fog rolled in." And just like that, the seed of doubt is planted. The moment when the mystery began. The year was 1994, or maybe 93. Nobody really remembers the exact date. What everyone does agree on, though, is that it started one cold autumn night in Brooklyn. A night so still and quiet that the sound of a passing car could echo for blocks. Somewhere near Flatbush Avenue, a group of college kids, all in their early 20s, were looking for a cheap way home after a long night of bar hopping. Too broke for cabs, and with the subway shut down for maintenance, they found themselves wandering the empty streets in search of a late-night bus. That's when one of them spotted it. "A bus!" someone shouted, pointing down the road. And sure enough, there it was, rolling out of the fog like something out of a noir film. The headlights had an odd, muted glow, not the sharp brightness you'd expect. In fact, the bus seemed almost too quiet. No rumble of an engine, no squeal of brakes as it came to a stop, just the soft hiss of its doors opening as though inviting them in. The group hesitated. There was something off about it right from the start. For one, the bus didn't look like the MTA fleet they were used to. Its paint job was faded and dull, with flecks of rust eating away at the edges. The number on the display above the windshield, dim and flickering, read 13. Never seen that route before. one of them muttered, furrowing his brow. Maybe it's new, another replied, already stepping forward. That hesitation didn't last long. The wind was picking up, carrying the kind of biting chill that sneaks through even the thickest jacket. None of them wanted to spend the night shivering on a curb. One by one they climbed aboard, the cold metal stairs creaking beneath their shoes. Inside, the bus was worse. Or better, depending on who you ask. The dim lighting cast long, exaggerated shadows, and the air felt unnaturally still, like stepping into a sealed room. The seats, though padded, were worn thin, the once bright fabric now faded to a murky gray. As they moved to find places to sit, they couldn't shake the impression that the bus had been abandoned for years before tonight, its still operating condition an odd, almost eerie contradiction. "Where's the driver?" one of them finally asked. They all turned toward the front of the bus, only to realize that the seat behind the wheel was empty. The controls seemed to operate themselves, levers shifting without pause, the wheel turning as though guided by an invisible hand. "Dude, is this even legal?" one of the guys whispered, trying to laugh but failing miserably. "Maybe it's automatic," one girl suggested nervously, hugging her jacket tighter. "Like, a prototype or something?" They tried to rationalize it, tried to laugh it off. But as the bus started moving, without warning and without anyone pushing that familiar stop button, they all fell into an uneasy silence. The bus didn't lurch or sway like a typical city ride. Instead, it glided forward smoothly, almost unnaturally so, as though it wasn't driving on asphalt at all. Outside the windows, the familiar shapes of brownstones and bodegas blurred into streaks of gray. Here's where the accounts start to diverge. Some say the bus didn't stop again, that it hurtled forward into the night, taking them farther and farther into uncharted streets that didn't appear on any map. Others claim it stopped frequently, at places they didn't recognize, abandoned lots, crumbling warehouses, eerie corners of the city where no one in their right mind would get off. What's clear is this: none of the 5 friends made it home that night. When they didn't show up the next morning, their families reported them missing. For weeks, flyers with their faces were plastered across Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. The papers ran stories about their strange disappearance, speculating about kidnappings, gang activity, even alien abductions. But as time passed, the case grew cold. Police never found any leads. Witnesses who might have seen them get on the bus? None. In fact, there was no record of Route 13 even running that night. Still, every so often someone would report seeing that same faded bus rolling through the fog, its dim lights flickering in the distance. And every time, the stories would circle back to that fateful night in 1994. The moment when 5 young kids thought they were hitching a ride home, only to vanish into New York City's darkest legend. The strange features of the bus. The first thing people notice about bus Route 13 is the way it looks, if they're brave enough to stand close enough for a good look, that is. Oddly enough, stories about its appearance are almost eerily consistent, even among people who've never met, spoken, or known each other. Everyone agrees. The bus isn't your ordinary mode of public transit. For starters, it seems old. Not just outdated, but ancient. Something that looks like it could have rolled off the assembly line sometime in the mid-20th century and then forgotten about under a mountain of rust and neglect. At first glance, it's easy to mistake it for a retired vehicle that somehow escaped the scrapyard. The body of the bus is a corroded metal husk painted in a faded, streaky gray, a shade that might have once been white, but now looks as though decades of soot and weather damage have stripped it completely of life. The words Route 13 are barely visible where a modern destination sign should be. Instead of the bright digital displays you see on every other MTA bus in New York, this one flickers with an old-school, almost incandescent light. The bulbs are weak, casting a dim glow that seems to struggle to stay alive. Sometimes witnesses describe that faint light as blinking in erratic bursts, like Morse code sent from another world. Flickering, never steady, one man described it. Like the bus itself isn't sure it's even there. Like it could disappear any second. And then, there are the headlights. This is where the really bizarre details start to creep in. Unlike the sharp white beams you'd expect from bus lights, these headlights emit a grayish, almost muddy illumination. It doesn't cut through the darkness. Instead, it seems to absorb it, pulling the shadows closer in a way that makes the surrounding air appear heavier, thicker. It's not uncommon to hear witnesses say that standing in the glow of those headlights gave them chills, or worse, an inexplicable sense of dread. It's like the light wasn't real light, one shaken observer claimed. It didn't brighten anything around it, it just made the shadows darker. The windows on the bus, too, are a source of fascination, if not outright fear. They're not clear like you'd expect, they're cloudy, and in some cases tinged with streaks of a dirty, yellowish substance that no one can quite identify. Some have claimed that, if you're standing close enough, you can almost see silhouettes moving behind the glass, but look closer, and the silhouettes seem to vanish, as if swallowed by the darkness inside. And speaking of the interior, that's where the descriptions turn chilling. Witnesses who claim to have boarded the bus describe something that feels almost frozen in time. The seats are tattered, their original vibrant colors faded to lifeless grays and browns. The fabric is worn thin, with frayed edges that look like they've been clawed at repeatedly. Some even say they notice strange stains on the seats, stains they'd rather not think too much about. The overhead bars and rails, once polished metal, are tarnished and smudged, as though they haven't been sanitized in decades. There's always a faint scent too. It's not the usual smell of sweat, coffee, and exhaust fumes you'd associate with public transit. Instead, it's something far more unsettling, damp and metallic like old pennies soaked in water. The doors are another peculiarity. They don't just open with the quick hiss and shift mechanics of a regular bus. No, these doors groan, long and slow, like they're protesting every time they move. It's a sound that sticks with people, described as something between a rusty hinge and a low, guttural moan. It was almost like the bus itself didn't want to let me on, one woman recalled. But perhaps the strangest feature of all is the distinct lack of a bus driver. No one has ever reported seeing someone behind the wheel. The space where the driver should sit is usually empty, or worse, obscured by darkness that seems unnatural, darker than the shadows around it. And yet the bus moves. The wheel turns, the brakes screech, and the engine hums low, as though some invisible force is guiding it with silent precision. It's almost like the bus drives itself, one man said after a run-in with it near Queens. But even that doesn't feel right. It's like something is there, behind the controls. Something you can feel but can't see. Even more unnerving is the sound, or lack thereof. While most buses rattle and roar as they wind through the pothole-ridden streets of New York, Route 13 moves almost noiselessly. Those who have seen it pass by swear they only hear faint hisses or whispers, as if the tires are barely skimming the surface of the road, and when it does come to a stop it doesn't lurch forward or jolt like a typical city bus. Instead it seems to pause perfectly, almost unnaturally, like a predator preparing to pounce. Everything about Bus 13 seems designed to unsettle, even the smallest, most inconsequential details. And maybe that's why the legend has persisted for so long. Something about it taps into a primal instinct, the kind of innate fear that tells us, this is wrong, this doesn't belong. The peculiar passengers. If you were bold or foolish enough to step onto Bus Route 13, what would await you might be far worse than just an empty, decaying bus. The real horror lies in its passengers. Or at least what people assume are passengers. Stories about the occupants of Bus 13 have been whispered in hushed tones for decades, and while eyewitness accounts are few, they all share unsettling similarities. First and foremost, the bus is never, ever truly empty. No matter the time of night or the stretch of road it's found on, there are always figures seated within. They're strangely still, so still that many hesitate to even call them human. You can tell something's not right the moment you step onto that bus, said one man who claimed to have had a brief, gut-wrenching encounter with it outside of Queens. At first I thought they were just dozing commuters, the usual crowd you'd find on a late-night ride. But then I realized they weren't moving, they weren't breathing, they were just there. Descriptions of these so-called passengers vary slightly but carry core consistencies. Most are shadowy silhouettes, seated upright with perfect posture, as though frozen in time. They're dressed in clothing from different eras. A trench coat that looks like it came straight out of the 1940s. A wide-brimmed hat that belonged more to a cowboy than a city dweller, or even an elegant fur collar more suited to Prohibition-era Manhattan. It's as if the bus collects not just people but fragments of history, and their faces? You can't see them, said a young woman who swore she saw the bus while leaving a bar in Brooklyn one foggy night. You'd think it was too dark, or maybe the windows were just dirty, but it's not that. There's something more. It's like the shadows cling to their faces, hiding them from view. The harder you try to focus, the harder it gets to make out any details. It's like your mind won't let you see them clearly. Those who've dared to sit in the rows among the passengers often describe an almost unbearable pressure, as if unseen eyes are watching their every move. Some report feeling an inexplicable chill that seeps into their bones, even if the bus looks sealed tight against the cold. Others have recounted more interactive experiences. One cab driver, after refusing to board the bus in Staten Island late one October night, claimed to watch as one of the figures inside turned to look directly at him. "I swear on my life," he said, voice shaking. "I saw its head move slowly in my direction, like it was trying to figure me out, like it was deciding if it should come for me too." But the truly bone-chilling detail lies in what happens when anyone tries to engage with the passengers. Whether it's a nervous laugh, a friendly hello, or a shaken attempt to ask for directions, the response is always the same: silence. No movement, no reaction, no acknowledgement. Just the weight of their presence growing heavier and heavier until it feels unbearable. Some survivors claim that the passengers are more than just unnerving, they're dangerous. There's a popular story about a pair of teenagers from Staten Island who hopped onto Bus 13 one rainy night, mostly on a dare. According to the tale, about a minute into their ride, one of them tried to poke one of the shadow commuters sitting across from them. The precise details get murky, like most urban legends, but the general consensus is that the shadow moved, and not just a small flinch. Allegedly, it turned sharply toward the teenager, faster than any human should be able to move, locking its dark, faceless form on him until the boy could barely scream. When the bus finally stopped, somewhere near a long deserted factory, the teenager staggered off, visibly shaken, while his friend, who'd never tried to make contact with the passengers, remained silent for weeks after whatever they saw inside, it left them marked in ways they couldn't, or wouldn't, explain. Another recurring thread within these stories is the seats themselves. Multiple witnesses have claimed that if a person sits on one of the occupied seats or even too close to one, they experience a strange feeling of being suffocated, as though the air itself thickens around that particular spot. "It felt like something was squeezing me from the inside out," said a construction worker, who insists he accidentally boarded the bus during a foggy commute home in the Bronx. "The moment I tried sitting next to one of those things, I couldn't breathe, I had to move, or I swear I wouldn't have made it." Then there's the theory that the shadowy figures are not just passengers but victims, souls trapped forever, inexplicably tied to whatever curse or otherworldly force powers Bus Route 13. This idea stems from another creepy pattern. People who've gone missing after supposedly boarding the bus seem to reappear as new shadowy commuters. There are whispers about people recognizing familiar clothing or body shapes, enough to suggest that riders doomed to vanish might eventually become part of the bus's ghostly ranks. And here's the most petrifying detail. No one has ever reported seeing one of these figures get on or off the bus. They're simply there, waiting, their silent presence an unchanging part of the bus's sinister folklore. If there's one thing most tales agree on, it's this: encountering the passengers on Bus Route 13 leaves a lasting imprint, one that washes over you in the still of the night when a gust of wind brushes your neck, or the darkness gets too thick to see through. Witnesses don't describe the experience as simply scary. It's the kind of fear that lingers, that tugs on the edges of your mind long after the encounter is over. As one shaken observer from Manhattan put it, "You don't forget. Not the way they look, not the way they made you feel, like you were outnumbered no matter how many people were actually there. Like they knew something you didn't. Like they'd already picked you as their next passenger." The mass disappearances. The strangest, most horrifying part of Bus Route 13's legend isn't the bus itself, or even the ghostly passengers that haunt its shadowy interior. It's the people, the living, breathing people, who stepped aboard, only to vanish without a trace. Disappearances tied to the bus have been whispered about for decades, rumors winding their way through neighborhoods, seedy bars, and crime blogs. Some dismiss them as mere coincidence, a tragic overlap of urban myths and real-life tragedy. Others, especially those who've seen the bus themselves, are adamant that the route is somehow tied to something much darker. The first widely recognized case dates back to the 1970s, but some believe it goes back even farther. A local legend circulates about two women who boarded a bus late one foggy evening in 1959 near Queens. They had been working late shifts and were too tired to notice anything unusual about the vehicle that pulled up. Witnesses at the bus stop remembered seeing the women climb aboard, chatting together as they disappeared behind the creaking, glacially slow folding doors. That was the last time they were ever seen. Their families reported them missing the very next day, kicking off a massive citywide search effort. Police canvassed the area, family members distributed flyers, and local newspapers covered the story relentlessly for weeks, yet no one ever saw or heard from them again. Stranger still, transit authorities insisted that no bus, certainly no Route 13, was scheduled to operate in that area at that time of night. None of the buses in their fleet matched the strange descriptions offered by witnesses. That would be eerie enough on its own, but it didn't stop there. Over the years, more disappearances followed, each one just as baffling as the last. A group of teenagers dared each other to hop on the bus in 1981, only for their belongings and backpacks to be found sitting untouched at the bus stop the next morning. None of them returned home. In 1994, 5 friends coming back from a house party in Brooklyn disappeared after supposedly boarding a late-night bus, matching the descriptions of Route 13. And in 2008, a construction worker was seen waving goodbye to his crew before climbing aboard what appeared to be an unusually old city bus. His co-workers swore they'd seen the bus pull away. That was the last anyone saw of him. But what makes all of these stories so chilling is the aftermath, or lack thereof. Bodies are never found. There are no ransom notes, no traces of foul play, no crime scene evidence at all, just sudden and complete absences, as if the missing individuals were plucked out of this world entirely. The families of the missing are often left with little more than frustrated guesses. Many hang on to the belief that their loved ones ran away, that they chose to disappear for reasons unknown. But others can't shake the nagging feeling that the bus itself, and perhaps the strange force controlling it, had something to do with their fates. Some even swear they've seen the missing riding bus Route 13, now relegated to being silent, unmoving figures trapped in the grayish gloom of the seats. Police investigations into the disappearances have all but hit brick walls. Officials, in the rare moments where they acknowledge these peculiar events, attribute it to mere coincidence. They argue that mass disappearances would obviously attract attention and leave evidence behind, which these stories clearly don't. In the few cases where blurry photos or grainy CCTV footage supposedly captured the bus, authorities have dismissed them as hoaxes or simple cases of coincidence, unfounded by hard evidence. Not a single credible lead has ever been tied directly to bus Route 13. But the people who've lived these legends won't let it go that easily. In neighborhoods like Red Hook, Bensonhurst, or Hell's Kitchen, locals talk about certain intersections or stretches of road as being cursed. You don't wait there late at night, warns an older resident of Brooklyn. If a bus you've never seen before pulls up, don't get on. It doesn't matter how tired or desperate you are. You wait for the sunrise. You hear me? Some stories get even weirder. A man in Williamsburg once claimed that his brother, who boarded the bus late one night in the 1990s and was never seen again, began appearing in his dreams. The brother warned him, over and over again, not to board the bus himself. "It's waiting, bro," the figure supposedly whispered in the dreams, his face pale and expression frozen in terror. It always waits. What stands out most about these disappearances is the fact that they seem selective. Hundreds, if not thousands, cross paths with bus Route 13 or claim to have seen its shadowy figure rolling through the streets late at night. Yet not everyone who boards goes missing. Some come off disturbed, shaken to their core, yet unharmed. Others vanish. What determines who stays and who goes? That's the question that chills even the skeptics. Theories abound, of course. Some blame the disappearances on entirely human factors, kidnappings, serial killers, or illegal trafficking. Others believe the missing are lured intentionally by something unexplainable attached to the bus, a curse, a ghostly phenomenon, or some kind of supernatural portal between worlds. There are even rumors which suggest that the bus chooses its passengers, seeking out those with a certain kind of sadness, people who might not fight, who might be lost enough in their own lives to simply give in. "I've noticed it," said one survivor, a security guard who swears he saw the bus while on patrol late at night. The people who vanish always seem, I don't know, a little off. Not always, but sometimes. Like if you were the bus, you'd know they were searching for something else, something no other ride could take them to. Whether it's truth, lies, or something in between, one thing remains chillingly consistent. Once you board bus Route 13, there's no guarantee you'll make it back. The Survivor's Tale. The rumors about bus Route 13 might send shivers down anyone's spine, but there's one story, one account, that unsettles even the most skeptical. It's rare to hear about someone stepping off bus 13 alive, much less willing to talk about it. And yet, occasionally, whispers surface about a man who claims to have been one of the survivors. His account is chilling, fragmented, and eerily detailed, the kind of thing that seeps into your mind and keeps you up at night, wondering if he's really just crazy, or if he's the last person to look into the abyss and come back. The man, who goes by James, he refuses to give his last name, came forward with his story once, during a late-night AM radio show in the early 2000s, one of those paranormal broadcasts that thrive on ghost stories and UFO sightings. At first, listeners dismissed him as just another caller trying to spin an urban legend, but his voice, the trembling honesty in the way he spoke, froze the host mid-laugh. This wasn't a prank. "I don't care if you believe me," James started, his voice cracking slightly. "I just need to get it out. I need someone to at least hear it. I wish I hadn't gotten on that goddamn bus, but—" He choked up. "But I did, and it wasn't a dream. It wasn't some hallucination. It was real. I know that much." What James described next was a memory that had haunted him since that night. He said it happened years ago in the winter of 1988. He'd been coming off a shift at a warehouse in Queens, bone-tired and more than a little drunk from the flask he had kept stashed in his coat. The streets were quiet, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers and toes, and the fog rolling in made it feel like the whole city had been swallowed up by some unseen force. James had been waiting for a bus. Any bus, really. His car had broken down earlier that week and he couldn't afford a cab. When he spotted the headlights through the fog, his relief was instant. He didn't think to check the route number. Why would he? A bus was a bus. "It was weird, though," James said during the broadcast. "Looking back, it should have scared me right away. But when you're tired, when you're cold, you ignore stuff. You tell yourself it's fine. But the light? The headlights weren't bright, they were dull, almost gray, like they were struggling to stay on. And the whole bus, it looked old. Not like used old, like wrong old, like it didn't belong here anymore." Despite the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine, James climbed aboard. The driver's seat was empty, but he convinced himself it was one of those new automated buses that the city was testing out. Whatever excuse helped him feel less afraid. He now admits to himself, and to the audience that night, that deep down he knew the truth. This was no ordinary bus. The ride started out smooth, too smooth. The bus didn't jolt like the usual MTA clunkers. "It didn't even feel like it was on the road," James whispered. "More like it was gliding." The other passengers, if you could call them that, were silent. Dead silent. He glanced around and felt his stomach tighten. They weren't normal. I don't know what they were, but they didn't look right. Shadows clung to their faces. All you could see were these shapes, outlines of people, but no faces. Nothing clear. I kept telling myself, "Don't stare, man, don't stare," but I couldn't help it. James tried to sit near the back, away from the other passengers, but no matter where he moved, he felt it, that suffocating pressure, like the air was too thick to breathe. Despite the cold outside, the bus felt unnaturally warm, humid even, like a storm was brewing right there in the cabin. And then there were the whispers. "It didn't start right away," James explained, his voice growing quieter on the line. "But after a while, I swear I started hearing things. Voices. Not loud, more like murmurs, like when you're underwater or half asleep. Except they weren't coming from outside the bus. They were inside, all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but they didn't feel right. They didn't feel human." The whispers grew louder as the bus plowed on. By then, James had lost all sense of direction. Nothing out the windows looked familiar. The streets were empty, and the fog outside had grown so thick that it could have been another world entirely. And then he saw it. One of the shadowy passengers, seated just a few feet away, moved. Not much, but just enough to send ice through his veins. The shape turned slightly toward him. The darkness where its face should have been now pointed directly at James. "I swear to God it was looking at me," he growled into the phone. "Even though it had no eyes, no face, I could feel it staring into me, like it knew me, like it was smiling somehow." The bus came to a sudden halt. The force of the stop threw James forward, nearly out of his seat. When he looked out the window, sheer panic set in. They weren't in Queens or Brooklyn or anywhere near New York. The bus had stopped at what looked like a vast, empty void, just blackness stretching as far as the eye could see. "That's when I ran," James said, his voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I forced the doors open. They groaned like they didn't want to let me go, but I kept pushing. And when I got out, I was back on the corner where I'd first gotten on, like no time had passed at all, but the bus was gone. Just gone." When the host pressed for details, why hadn't James reported it? Why didn't he take pictures? He snapped. "You think I could focus on that?" he shouted. "I was lucky to be alive. I don't even know if I got away clean. I still hear them sometimes. In my dreams. Whispering. Watching." To this day, James remains the only person who claims to have survived the full experience of Bus Route 13. Whether you believe him or not, his story fits eerily well with the other accounts. Even small details like the bus's peculiar glow or the suffocating atmosphere inside. And while skeptics write him off as just another urban legend enthusiast, James insists he's telling the truth. "I don't care if you believe me," he said, his final words on the broadcast. "What matters is that the bus is still out there. And if you see it, if those gray headlights come creeping through the fog, you don't get on. You hear me? You don't get on." A portal to the underworld. Some say Bus Route 13 isn't just a strange anomaly or a forgotten piece of transit history. It's far more than an urban legend about a haunted bus driving through the streets of New York. To those who've seen it, or worse, claim to have boarded it, there's a darker theory whispered in alleyways and late-night paranormal forums. Route 13 doesn't lead you anywhere on this earth. Instead, they say it's a pathway, a direct line into the underworld itself. The bus's infamous aura of mystery, they argue, isn't because it's haunted. It's because it doesn't belong here. It exists in our world only as a facade, some kind of gateway to a dimension that operates in the shadows of our own reality. What lies on the other side? That's where the stories grow wild, speculative, and utterly spine-chilling. Have you ever thought about the number 13, one whispered account begins, told by a purported occult historian from Brooklyn? In every culture, it's the harbinger of bad luck, chaos, misfortune. It's a liminal number. It teeters on the edge of complete order like 12 months in a year or 12 hours on a clock. 13 is messy. It belongs nowhere. That's not a coincidence because neither does the bus it's named after. It's always been out of place. Out of reality. For decades, spiritualist theories about Bus 13 have circulated among believers. One of the strongest and most unsettling revolves around the idea that the bus is a physical manifestation of a threshold between the mortal world and the afterlife. While most think of the afterlife as bridges, glowing tunnels, or stairways, others argue it could just as easily be something much more mundane. Why not a bus? It's the kind of vehicle you don't question, one you'd climb aboard by habit. And if it takes you to your final destination, well, maybe that's the point. There have always been stories about crossings, says Pastor Elijah Wilkes, a spiritual consultant who's caught up in the lore of Route 13. Think about folklore dating back centuries. Charon ferried souls across the river Styx in Greek mythology. The Norse spoke of the Jalabru, the bridge to the land of the dead. Cultures all over the world agree there's always a vehicle, some means of transport, that connects the living to what lies beyond. Who's to say that for us, here in modern-day New York, that vehicle isn't Bus 13? The connections don't stop there. Several sightings of the bus coincide with neighborhoods that are already steeped in macabre history or superstition. Red Hook, once notorious for its crime and desolation, is well known for its ghost stories and forgotten graves. There's even an intersection in Prospect Park that locals avoid at night, claiming they've seen hazy outlines of a bus with dim gray headlights materializing out of the mist. For many, these aren't just random places, they're pressure points where the boundary between this world and the next might be thinner than we think. Then there's the case of David Flores, a historian with an interest in esoteric energies. Flores has long studied the strange spiritual echoes that supposedly linger in New York City's underbelly. He once found disturbing parallels between Bus Route 13 sightings and the locations of mass tragedies, industrial accidents, forgotten murders, even an unmarked potter's field where thousands of the city's dead were buried over a century ago. Flores swears that the bus doesn't follow just any route. It follows the scars of history, as though drawn to places soaked with loss, despair, and forgotten souls. You'll hear the skeptics laugh, Flores says. They all say it's a coincidence, right? But how many coincidences does it take before you start asking questions? Take the Williamsburg Bridge. People have jumped off it for years. Generations. Did you know that there were 2 sightings of Bus 13 near that bridge in the last decade? At unholy hours just before sunrise? Why there? Why then? And why does nobody, not even the MTA, have records of that bus being scheduled at those times? Another layer of the theory plunges deeper. Among spiritualists, especially those who trace occult phenomena, There's a belief that Bus Route 13 doesn't just carry spirits to their destination, it collects them. Some even go so far as to claim the passengers who vanish aboard the bus aren't simply disappearing, they're being taken. Think of it like this: every culture has its stories about the dead lingering too long, ghosts, restless spirits, and maybe, just maybe, Bus 13 acts as some kind of cleanup crew for the unseen world, scooping up lost souls, unfinished lives, or those teetering on the edge of life and death. One chilling account comes from a woman who claims she boarded the bus in January 1997. She vividly remembers being surrounded by strange, still passengers, their faces obscured by shadows and a thick sort of uneasy gloom. "They act like they don't see you," she said in a blog post recounting her story. "Until they do, and when they do you'll feel it. It's like your entire body goes still, like they're deciding something." She doesn't remember much after that, just that the bus didn't feel like it was moving through the city anymore. The windows were pitch black, reflecting nothing but the dim, ghostly glow of the overhead lights. When the bus finally stopped, how long later, she couldn't tell, it opened its doors and let her out at the exact corner where she'd gotten on, as though no time had passed at all. Yet, she recalled sensing a few seats now empty that weren't when she'd boarded. Theories like hers suggest a terrifying possibility, that Bus 13 doesn't just take those who belong to the living world, sometimes it mistakes the living for the dead. "There are no guarantees," warns Pastor Wilkes in somber fashion. "If that cursed bus pulls up alongside you, don't look too hard and don't fall for the illusion of safety. It wants people who linger, on the streets, in their own lives, or even between worlds, and it knows when you're close enough to take." The most unsettling aspect of the underworld connection is the simplest, and perhaps the hardest to ignore. Think of how easily it could happen. You're tired, late at night, waiting at a stop in the middle of nowhere. A bus you've never seen before pulls up, but you don't study it too deeply. You climb aboard, tell yourself the driver isn't there because it's automated. You quiet your gut instincts and sit down. And once you're in its grip, does it even let you realize you're no longer in the world you knew? Key areas of Bus Route 13. Ask anyone who's heard of Bus Route 13, and they'll likely tell you the same thing. It doesn't stick to a fixed route. Unlike the meticulously planned lines of the New York City transit system, this bus doesn't show up on maps, schedules, or official transit documents. Instead, it seems to appear in very specific locations, areas with histories as dark and twisted as the legend itself. These hot spots for sightings have become something of an urban roadmap for those trying to piece together the route of this spectral vehicle. Some of these areas are steeped in tragedy. Others seem chosen for their isolation, their forgotten corners of the city, where the streetlights flicker and the fog rolls in thick, swallowing the streets whole. If there's one consistent thread, it's this. Every location tied to Bus Route 13 carries an eerie energy, a sense of unease that settles into your bones the moment you step foot there. 1. Williamsburg Bridge and surrounding area. One of the most infamous locations associated with Bus Route 13 is the area near the Williamsburg Bridge. Stretching over the East River, the bridge connects Manhattan and Brooklyn and has been the site of countless tragedies over the years. Suicide attempts, industrial accidents, and even violent crimes have made the bridge a local hotbed for morbid tales and ghost stories. More than one passerby claims to have seen the bus rolling through the haze just before sunrise, its faint headlights flickering in the mist like two dying stars. One man, a late-night security guard in the area, swore he heard the screech of brakes echo across the empty streets as the bus pulled up to a stop just off the bridge ramp. "It just sat there," he said, his voice trembling in a podcast interview years later, "like it was waiting, but no one got on and no one got off, and then it just vanished." Locals have dubbed the Williamsburg Bridge a crossing point, not just for the living, but perhaps for those teetering between this life and the next. 2. Red Hook's Lonely Corners. Red Hook, once a bustling industrial neighborhood in Brooklyn, now carries an air of abandonment that fits the ghostly reputation of Bus Route 13. Its lonely docks and boarded-up warehouses make for the perfect setting for a ghost story. Over the decades, several sightings of the bus have been reported in the area, usually late at night when the fog rolls in from the waterfront, cloaking the streets in an eerie silence. One longshoreman claimed he saw the bus pull up to an intersection near an old factory late one October night in 1978. "It didn't look right," he said in an archived interview. "You know how you watch an old movie reel and the edges go all grainy? It looked like that. The damn bus looked like it wasn't even part of this world." No passengers boarded or left the bus, he said, but he distinctly heard a low, guttural groaning sound like a deep exhale when the doors creaked open. He didn't stick around to see what, if anything, was inside. 3. The abandoned lots of Bensonhurst, known for its quiet, family-friendly streets, wouldn't strike most as the kind of place for a ghostly encounter, but locals know better. Tucked away in its quieter corners are dozens of forgotten lots, vacant spaces where buildings once stood, now overgrown with weeds and fenced off from prying eyes. These lots have become infamous for their ties to Bus Route 13. A cab driver once reported seeing the bus idling in front of one such lot at around 3 a.m. He said the lot was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels all-consuming, like it's swallowing sound and light alike. The bus's headlights looked dim, almost reluctant to cut through the inky blackness. And yet, he swore he could see faint, shadowy shapes moving in the windows, the kind of shifting shadows that make your stomach knot without ever really knowing why. Some believe the abandoned lots served as dumping grounds for dark deeds in the city's past, crimes that were forgotten by paperwork, but not by the energies that linger. 4. Prospect Park and its western edge. By day, Prospect Park is a peaceful haven full of joggers, dog walkers, and picnics, but at night its winding paths take on a far more sinister tone. The western edge of the park in particular has been a frequent spot for sightings of Bus Route 13. Locals often describe feeling an inexplicable sense of dread while walking the streets nearby, an almost magnetic pull to look over their shoulders or linger under the flickering glow of unreliable streetlights. One retired schoolteacher recalled an experience from 1993 while walking home after visiting a friend nearby. She'd opted to cut through the park, but stopped short when she saw headlights emerging from the mist. The bus rolled toward her, silent except for the groaning of its ancient frame, and stopped just 30 feet away. "I couldn't move," she said. "It didn't feel real, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see, and before I knew it, the bus was gone. Just gone. Like it had never been there in the first place." 5. Queens' forgotten streets. Lastly, Queens, home to a maze of residential neighborhoods, industrial zones, and warehouse strips, has its own share of eerie corners where Bus Route 13 has been spotted. One particularly notorious area is near an old railway crossing in the Maspeth section of Queens. The tracks, long out of operation, cut through a desolate stretch of road flanked by crumbling brick buildings and overgrown lots. It's here that several night watchmen have claimed to hear the unmistakable hiss of the bus's brakes, even when no headlights came into view. A construction foreman, working on site late into a January evening in 2005, reported actually seeing the bus pass by his lot. "It wasn't moving like a normal bus," he recounted. "It glided like a boat, smooth as ice, and the windows, man, those windows were pitch black, but I swear I could feel someone or something looking at me through them." The map of mystery. If you were to connect all the known sightings onto a map of New York, you wouldn't find a clear route. What you'd find instead is a patchwork of haunted locations, isolated corners of the city tied together by sorrowful energies and forgotten tragedies, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Bus Route 13 doesn't have a route the way other buses do. Maybe it moves between the cracks of reality, drawn to places where the veil between worlds is thinnest. Where will it show up next? Most locals hope they'll never find out. Reactions from authorities. It's not surprising that every mystery, especially one as persistent and eerie as Bus Route 13, eventually grabs the attention of the officials. With decades of urban rumors, frightening eyewitness accounts, and whispers of disappearances linked to an impossible bus, rumors like this don't simply whisper their way through New York City streets without nudging the ears of the people in charge. What's astonishing, though, is how little the authorities have been able or willing to do about it. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, MTA, the institution responsible for one of the largest and most complicated transit systems in the world, has been a natural focal point for public inquiry. Everything from missing person cases to social media ghost hunters have tried to pressure the MTA into looking into this so-called ghost bus. However, official answers have always led to a dead end. No official records. This phrase has been repeated time and time again, almost as if the officials have rehearsed it. As first reported back in the 1970s, the MTA has claimed there is no clear evidence that a Route 13 ever existed, or at least, not in recent memory. "If this was an old route, it predates anything in my department's records," an MTA spokesperson once told a tabloid journalist in 2001 when asked about the legend of the bus. Transit schedules from decades ago aren't digitized the way they are now, so if you're telling me about a bus from the 1950s or even the 1930s, Good luck finding proof of it. But even if the route number is no longer in service, that explanation doesn't account for the strange sightings, and any attempt to push further on those eerie accounts is often met with blank stares or outright dismissal. This is New York. That's another common response from officials when pressed about Bus 13. You've got 7 buses breaking down, 3 driver complaints, and an overcrowded train all happening in the same hour. A phantom bus? Come on, I can barely manage the ones in service. One former MTA operations manager reportedly joked during an interview for a New York Post article covering the infamous urban legend. It's easy to chalk up these responses as skepticism or bureaucratic indifference, but some believe there's more to it. A growing portion of New Yorkers, particularly those invested in the supernatural and paranormal, are convinced that the MTA knows far more than it lets on. Why wouldn't they? After all, if a bus with no schedule, no accounted driver, and no service number is cruising through city streets, then rolling into literal fog without a trace, the transit department would have ways of tracking it. Wouldn't they? A mystery they don't want solved? Beyond the MTA, NYPD detectives have also been drawn into the story's orbit, especially during the high-profile disappearance cases of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Law enforcement, however, has faced accusations of failing to scrutinize leads that seem connected to the supernatural. Despite several missing persons cases allegedly linked to Bus 13, the NYPD has officially denied making any connection between disappearances and sightings of an unofficial bus. Detectives working on such cases often brush away public speculation. "A ghost bus didn't kidnap anyone," scoffed an NYPD spokesperson in a 1995 press conference when asked about the simultaneous disappearances of 5 young friends in Brooklyn, allegedly after boarding an unknown bus. "We investigate based on evidence, and buses don't disappear." But could a lack of physical evidence point to something far eerier? Some insist it's too neat, too clean, as if details about sightings of the bus have been swept under the bureaucratic rug. Several police insiders have quietly admitted there's often little on-the-ground tracking for reports as strange as these. If a bus is involved, it usually leaves behind CCTV footage, tire markings, something. An anonymous NYPD investigator told a local independent journalist in 2017. But there's nothing. No prints, no signals, just fog and confusion. Transit or something else entirely. One of the strangest aspects of the authorities' response is their refusal to formally investigate sightings despite growing recognition of Bus Route 13 in popular culture. Paranormal investigative groups like New York City's Urban Haunt Society have noted sightings of the bus as frequently occurring near key, haunted spots or locations tied to tragedies, causing a rift between frustrated hobbyists and unconvinced officials. If the MTA didn't invent Route 13, then what is it? How does a thing like this just exist and vanish without them taking responsibility, or at least some level of ownership? Asked a frustrated amateur detective on a supernatural podcast in an episode dedicated to New York mysteries. The MTA's skepticism has been unwavering. If odds and ends have been swept aside for PR convenience, it wouldn't be uncharacteristic for a city that runs on order and appearances. With millions riding buses daily, the mere suggestion that the MTA has operating vehicles beyond their control could easily spiral into public panic or political backlash. More than one whistleblower has come forward with insider accounts of quiet investigations into claims about Bus 13. If these are to be believed internally, senior officials have acknowledged the urban legend, but as an operational headache, not a ghost story. Some people think there's something supernatural happening, an alleged retired MTA supervisor wrote on an anonymous blog post in 2015, but my guess, if and when Bus 13 was around, it was probably part of some old experimental route, maybe retired, unregistered, or maybe it wasn't ours. The chilling post ended with the cryptic line, "You'd be surprised what rolls through this city at night." Blurred boundaries and the fear of public panic. The authorities' official stance, or lack thereof, has left residents wondering what's being left unsaid. When grainy cell phone videos of faded buses rolling through foggy intersections have popped up online, city responses range from dismissing the footage to analyzing it for tampering, always with an air of polite deflection. Even paranormal researchers have started calling attention to broader government institutions beyond just the MTA. Some openly speculate that there's a connection between the sightings and what they refer to as veil-thin zones, locations in New York that allegedly blur the line between the living world and something darker. Whether Route 13 represents a failure of transportation oversight or something truly extraordinary, nobody currently working in government has committed to investigating it publicly. If the MTA or NYPD knows anything more about Bus Route 13 than they admit, they've clearly decided it's not worth risking credibility to talk about. But silence might say more than words ever could. Spiritual theories. For all its mysterious appearances and unsolvable riddles, the story of Bus Route 13 hits an oddly personal chord. People don't just talk about it in terms of a mere urban legend, they talk about it like it means something. And to the spiritually minded, there's no doubt. The bus isn't just a rogue vehicle from some forgotten fleet, it's something other. Something that operates on a deeper, more metaphysical level that humanity is only barely able to comprehend. It's a shadowy figure that doesn't fit neatly into religious texts or scientific inquiry, but somewhere in between, a ghostly emissary, a collector of lost souls, or maybe even a tool of cosmic justice. Whatever it is, theories about Bus Route 13 tend to lean hard into the spiritual, as people struggle to rationalize what it could be and why it exists. The theory of the soul collector. One of the most popular and chilling theories surrounding the bus revolves around its passengers. People who've encountered Bus Route 13, or claim to, consistently describe an unnatural presence, sometimes in the form of shadowy, motionless commuters seated in near darkness, other times in the deafening silence that hovers throughout the cabin. Those figures, the ones whose faces can never truly be seen, are at the heart of what many spiritualists refer to as the collected. According to these theories, Bus Route 13 isn't just a vehicle, it's a harvester. The passengers locked within its rotting shell aren't simply ghosts. They're people, or rather, the spiritual echoes of people, who've been claimed by some kind of higher, unknowable force. All cultures have stories about the ferryman, says Dr. Alison Graves, a folklore expert who studied the spiritual connections tied to urban myths like this one. You see it in ancient Greece, where Charon ferried the dead across the river Styx. You see it in Norse mythology with figures like Modgud guarding the Jalarbru Bridge. The method is always the same. There's a vehicle, a pathway, that exists for those transitioning between two realms. Whether it's a boat, a bridge, or in this case, a gnarly old bus, the pattern remains consistent. Graves posits that Bus Route 13 operates in much the same way as these mythological crossings. When it appears, it isn't just driving through New York, it's driving between worlds. Most of the time its passengers are unseen, spirits hitching a ride to their ultimate destination. But sometimes, the theory goes, the bus encounters someone who isn't quite ready to stay in the land of the living. It doesn't pick people randomly, Graves explains. It finds the ones who linger, the people who are at their breaking point, spiritually speaking, the lost, the broken, the wandering. It's not taking them against their will, it's giving them an out. This view of Route 13 as a sort of supernatural soul collector also explains why so many sightings are tied to emotionally and historically charged locations. Near the Williamsburg Bridge, where despair has driven countless souls to tragic ends. In Red Hook, rumored to be one of New York's most haunted neighborhoods. In forgotten industrial yards where the line between past and present feels razor thin. The bus is drawn to these places, spiritualists believe, because they're naturally closer to the boundary between the living world and what lies beyond. Theories of purgatory and the in-between. Another prominent theory paints Bus Route 13 not as a collector but as a prison, a moving purgatory where the unlucky passengers are doomed to ride for eternity. Several faiths describe a kind of in-between state for those caught between life and death, something akin to purgatory or limbo. And to those who believe in this interpretation, there's no doubt. Route 13 is this liminal space, one that physically manifests as a weathered old bus rolling through the forgotten corners of New York City. If you look at where the bus is most often spotted, one paranormal investigator explained during a podcast interview, it's always in these foggy, isolated streets. It doesn't show up on Fifth Avenue or Times Square. No, it sticks to the shadows because that's what it's made of. It's a physical manifestation of unresolved energy. It's a bridge, but a broken one. It's not taking people to the afterlife, it's trapping them in the in-between. These stories often tie directly into the eerie phenomena reported by so-called survivors. The bus doesn't feel like it's moving through New York at all, but instead through a fog-drenched, timeless void. The windows grow darker, the air grows heavier, and time itself seems to stretch into infinity. One tale describes a rider who claimed they saw other figures trying to leave the bus when it slowed, only to vanish the moment they stepped beyond the cabin doors. It was like they weren't allowed off, the witness recounted, like they were meant to stay there forever. Is the bus a judge? A smaller but persistent theory among spiritual thinkers suggests Bus Route 13 doesn't just deliver souls, it evaluates them. Passengers who board the bus, according to this theory, face some kind of supernatural reckoning while inside. Whether it's through their interaction with the shadowy figures or the bus itself, riders essentially choose their spiritual fate without realizing it. It's kind of like a spiritual test, explained Reverend Keith Leary, a self-proclaimed demonologist who organizes ghost tours in Staten Island. The bus doesn't trap just anyone, it shows up to people who are already haunted, in their hearts, in their souls. And once you're on, it forces you to make a choice. Maybe that choice isn't even conscious, but you make it all the same, and if you fail, you don't just vanish, you become part of the bus itself. This interpretation fits eerily well with the repeated legends of people who've gone missing after boarding the bus, only to be spotted later in its windows as mysterious, shadowy figures. Some spiritualists believe these passengers are the ones who failed, cursed to ride forever, serving as a warning to the living. The bus as a spirit itself. The most unconventional of the theories comes from those who argue that Bus Route 13 is no mere vehicle, it's alive. Not alive in the biological sense, but in the spiritual sense. They say buildings can hold energy, right? Old houses, battlefields, places where something tragic happened. That energy gets imprinted, gets stuck. Who's to say a bus can't do the same, says paranormal researcher Lee Harton, who has spent years chasing urban myths across the tri-state area. According to this idea, something happened to Bus 13, or on its route, so dark and so monumental that it became a sentient being, charged with energy that keeps it active long after it should have been scrapped. Whether that energy is ghostly, demonic, or something else entirely depends on who you ask. The bus isn't just driving the route, Harton says, the bus is the route. The disappearances, the sightings, the way it moves, it's all connected, like the bus isn't just part of the system but something that lives within it. The warning in the fog. Regardless of which theory people believe, whether the bus is a tool of the afterlife, a collector, or something even scarier, one thing always remains the same: the warning. Over and over, the consensus is clear. If you see Bus Route 13 pulling up alongside you, if you glimpse those dim headlights penetrating the fog, don't get on. From stories to pop culture, every city has its legends, but few take on the cultural life that Bus Route 13 has managed to achieve, and not just in New York City. What began as whispered stories or fleeting fog-shrouded sightings turned into a fully fledged urban myth, and as word spread from neighborhood bars, late-night diners, and whispered ghost stories, the idea of Bus 13 embedded itself not only in the minds of New Yorkers, but also into the broader imagination of American pop culture. Today, Route 13 isn't just an isolated urban legend, it's a muse for artists, filmmakers, authors, and even musicians. It's transformed from a spooky bus story into a metaphor for the unknown. Hollywood's obsession with haunted rides. It didn't take long for Hollywood to latch onto the mystique of Bus Route 13. It's a perfect blend of classic horror tropes, an unassuming vehicle that turns into a harbinger of doom, shadowy passengers with chilling backstories, and the visceral terror of stepping onto something that may never let you off again. In the late 1990s, during a wave of urban legend-inspired films like Urban Legend and Candyman, Bus Route 13 was rumored to have inspired an unproduced script about a haunted bus driving people into the afterlife. Though the project never saw the light of day, the legend didn't stop inspiring filmmakers. Pieces of Bus Route 13's narrative can be seen in eerie horror movies like Final Destination, with its obsession with inescapable death, or The Midnight Meat Train, where the everyday grit of the NYC subway turns horrifyingly supernatural. More directly, Bus 13 made a cryptic cameo in an indie short film titled The Last Ride, 2004, depicting shadowy passengers traveling to a desolate end station where the rules of life no longer applied. Filmmakers have also leaned into the idea as a reference in ghost tour-themed horror thrillers, almost always framing a rogue bus as a symbol of fate. And then there's television. Popular supernatural shows have paid homage to the legend, most notably in Supernatural, where one early episode, Route 666, played with the idea of cursed vehicles. While it wasn't explicitly about Bus Route 13, fans noticed its inspiration, particularly in the muted headlights and empty driver's seat visuals that mirror eyewitness descriptions of the ghostly transit legend. Books and literature. The bus that never stops, Bus Route 13, has also rolled into the realm of storytelling through literature. In fact, some believe the outsider energy of the bus finds its most comfortable home in books, where its eerie, isolating presence can simmer over pages rather than rush to thrill on screen. In horror anthologies, short stories like Midnight Passenger and The Fog Rolls In spin their own variations of the Bus Route 13 mystery. These tales usually follow unlucky commuters who ride late at night and meet strange ends, with each author pulling from core elements of the urban legend: the thick fog, the flickering lights, and the feeling that you've crossed into someplace you can't come back from. More creatively, Bus Route 13 has inspired metaphor-heavy works in modern speculative fiction. In best-selling novels like Night Stations or The Farewell Line, mysterious, otherworldly transit systems serve as both literal and emotional metaphors for death, transition, or the haunting weight of regret. While these works may not mention Route 13 directly, its fingerprints can be seen in every shadowed bus and ghostly train car described in their chapters. Music, midnight melodies. The haunting atmosphere of Route 13 hasn't just inspired writers and filmmakers, it's left its eerie signature on the music scene as well. Ambiance-heavy electronic artists and experimental rock bands have adopted the legend for a darker flavor. One popular underground album titled The 13th Passenger, 2012, wove distorted urban noises like the hiss of air brakes and the faint whispering of passengers into a spine-tingling listening experience. County Line Ghosts, a small, cult-favorite American folk band, even released a single-titled late-night line in the early 2010s. The song, structured as a mournful ballad, recounts the experience of someone boarding a spectral bus and realizing too late that they can never leave. The last lines, haunting in their simplicity, are often quoted within paranormal circles. When wheels keep turning, you can't get off. Through the fog it glides with everything you lost. The myth resonates in music genres ranging all the way from doom metal to atmospheric jazz, where storytellers weave Route 13's eerie reputation into haunting soundscapes that capture the bus's lonely, inescapable mood. Art and indie communities. Bus 13's most surprising footprint might actually be in the world of visual arts. Urban artists across New York City have used its image to build on its mythical status. Graffiti murals featuring skeletal buses winding through fog have popped up on both sides of the Williamsburg Bridge and in abandoned corners of Queens. One notorious and anonymously created mural painted off a dead-end street in Red Hook shows a haunted bus with shadowy figures riding inside, their faint silhouettes staring out at passers-by with blank faces. The local lore? The mural itself appears and disappears, much like the legend it depicts. More widely, online communities of digital artists have made the Route 13 phenomenon global. Reddit threads and online forums filled with surreal renderings of ghostly vehicles have reframed the bus as a metaphor for existential dread, providing inspiration for others to create everything from eerie game mod scenarios to experimental short animations. Entire indie horror games hosted on itch.io center around fictionalized ghost buses, inspired heavily by the legendary stories of New York's Bus Route 13. Merchandise, from local gimmick to global creepfest. Of course, no urban myth is complete without a commercial side hustle. Restaurants and bars with paranormal themes have leaned into the creepy appeal of Bus Route 13. A small Brooklyn cocktail bar even named one of their signature drinks the 13th Stop, a ghostly blue concoction served with swirling dry ice fog. Taxi and ghost tour companies in NYC have also woven Bus 13 into their haunted routes, offering faux recreations of the route's supposed famous haunts. Remarkably though, Bus Route 13 has even gone global, inspiring merch in unexpected corners of the internet. Digital artists sell posters and spooky enamel pins featuring atmospheric bus stop imagery, forever tying the anonymous veneer of urban life to thoughts of supernatural danger. Why it endures in pop culture. The reason for Bus Route 13's staying power in pop culture is deeper than just a love of ghost stories. It's the relatability of the terror. Unlike a haunted mansion or a remote forest cabin, Route 13 is a symbol of the mundane, the public transportation system millions of people use every single day. To imagine that something so familiar, so ingrained in our daily routine, could transform into a portal to the unknown, is an idea that resonates universally. It's not about the bus, wrote one urban mythologist reflecting on the allure of Route 13. It's about the way it makes you think, the way it reminds us that something ordinary, something like a bus stop or a lonely ride home, can turn into something that you can't explain, something that watches you from the corner of your mind and waits patiently in the fog. That mix of normality and dread has turned Bus Route 13 into a cultural fixture. Whether it's lurking in urban horror films, hidden in the lyrics of haunting folk ballads, or staring at you from a mural on the side of a forgotten building, the legend will continue to inspire stories for years to come. After all, there's a reason people keep telling the story. And maybe lurking behind all the art, the songs, and the films is the same persistent, unsettling question. What if it's real? How's that? I built out its presence in nearly every niche of pop culture, exploring movies, books, music, and even merchandise, all while keeping it steeped in the eerie, ominous vibe of a true urban legend. Let me know if you'd like anything else fleshed out. Will the mystery ever be solved? The story of Bus Route 13 has haunted New York City for decades, from its first whispered accounts in foggy streets to its adoption into books, movies, and songs. It remains one of the oldest, most persistent urban legends of the modern age. But as the decades stretch on, one question always lingers: will we ever know the truth? For the believers, the bus is a stationary piece of mystery, a supernatural phenomenon that exists outside the boundaries of human explanation. To the skeptics, it's a handful of coincidences strung together into a larger-than-life ghost story. Regardless of which side you're on, one thing is certain: Route 13 is a puzzle no one has been able to solve, and maybe no one ever will. An untraceable legend. The first challenge in unraveling the mystery lies in its slippery, almost intangible nature. Bus Route 13 refuses to be pinned down. There are no timetables, no operating schedules, no confirmed records of its existence in the official logs of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, MTA. Stories conflict, even eyewitness accounts from so-called survivors shift in the details, the time of night, the neighborhoods, the landmarks. This vagueness lends itself to both sides of the debate. Skeptics argue that without tangible evidence, photographs, artifacts, transit records, there's no reason to take Route 13 seriously. It's a campfire story, one investigative journalist shrugged in an in-depth documentary about urban myths filmed in 2018. Without data, it's nothing more than a creepy bedtime tale for bored New Yorkers. But believers take a different view. The inconsistency, they argue, is the point. Ghost stories, after all, never appear in neat, documentable packages. To them, Bus Route 13 operates out of phase with reality, slipping in and out of our world in ways that can never be fully traced or predicted. Like a modern Flying Dutchman, or a phantom train racing through half-completed tunnels in a forgotten dimension, Bus Route 13's mystery isn't something you can crack with a map or a magnifying glass. It's bigger than that. You can't solve it, paranormal investigator Nathan Rourke told a packed audience in Brooklyn at a public folklore seminar in 2020. That's the wrong question. Ghost stories like this aren't puzzles, they're reflections. On ourselves, on the city, on the things we know but can't prove. If you think you're going to find the bus's schedule written in some lost archive, you're not listening to what the story is telling you. Theories versus reality, a divide that fuels the mystery. Over the years, countless theories have risen to try to explain Bus Route 13, with camps of believers and skeptics locked in an endless debate. Some argue Route 13 is simply a long-running hoax, fueled by overlapping urban myths and a dose of imagination. Others insist it's a reflection of real, tragic disappearances that have been reshaped over the years into the folklore we hear today. For skeptics, the most comfortable explanation is that the sightings of Bus 13 are psychological phenomena. Familiar chaos, one psychologist theorized during a podcast on urban legends. Late at night in the fog, your mind can easily fill in the blanks where fear and exhaustion linger. The sound of a distant bus engine becomes sinister, shadows behind dirty windows turn into passengers with blurred faces. Just enough mystery can send your imagination spiraling. But then, there are the believers. The ones who've seen the headlights at 3 a.m. piercing through the fog, who've stood at desolate stops and felt something shift in the air, even when they couldn't explain it. These witnesses, or at least those who believe their accounts, argue that the patterns are too strange, the descriptions too consistent, to dismiss. Why would a fragile piece of folklore persist so stubbornly across decades without the kernel of a real truth at its core? Some spiritualists argue that Bus Route 13 can't be solved because it's not just a bus, it's a concept, a manifestation of things humanity still doesn't fully understand. Liminal spaces, the moment between life and death, the eternal rift between the known and the unexplainable. For them, the mystery lies precisely in its ambiguity. It's more than a story. Reverend Margot Chandler said during a 2015 panel on ghostly urban lore. It's a riddle New York carries in its bones. Some riddles don't want an answer, and maybe this is one of them. Maybe it's better that way. The search for evidence. Despite statements like Chandler's, plenty of people have tried to find that answer. Over the years, amateur investigators, paranormal hobbyists, and even hardened journalists have launched full-scale hunts for the origins of Bus Route 13. Books have been written, sometimes with the sharp tinge of skepticism, other times leaning heavily into supernatural speculation. The internet, of course, has fueled this obsession like nothing else. Entire corners of Reddit, obscure paranormal blogs, and YouTube documentary channels are dedicated to piecing together potential clues. Overlapping sightings are mapped out with pinpoint precision. Witness testimonies are cross-referenced, attempting to identify common threads, specific intersections, reoccurring descriptions, even weather patterns during the sightings. Yet, no definitive proof, no CCTV footage or GPS pings, has ever emerged to confirm Route 13's existence, and this noticeable absence only adds to its terrible allure. It's not that the evidence doesn't exist. It's that something perhaps is making sure it remains hidden. A deliberate cover-up, a glitch in reality, or something much bigger. Does New York even want an answer? It may be cynical, but one has to wonder. Does New York even want the truth about Bus Route 13? This city, built on stories, thrives on its legends. From the ghosts said to wander Ellis Island to the haunted brownstones of the West Village, New York is half memory, half myopia. What makes Bus Route 13 so enduring is precisely its lack of resolution. Part of why we keep talking about it is because it's not solved, one New Yorker commented during a podcast about local ghost stories. The moment it gets figured out, it won't be scary anymore. It won't feel like this living thing that could happen to anyone, anywhere. It'll just be history. There's a kind of beauty in unsolved mysteries, though it's the dark, unsettling kind of beauty that echoes through subway tunnels and lonely street corners after midnight. Route 13 captures this perfectly. It represents everything unresolved, each story that ended without an explanation, each cliffhanger that leaves us wide awake at night. The final stop. So will the mystery of Bus Route 13 ever be solved? Maybe, but that's not really the point. Its power lies in its elusiveness, in its constant ability to slip through the cracks of the living world. To know it would rob it of its haunting essence, of the stories whispered late at night over cups of coffee and giggles that turn into nervous glances over shoulders. Bus Route 13 is, at its core, a metaphor as much as it is a ghost story. It's about the things we lose control over, and the places in life where answers vanish into the fog. Whether it's just a phantom bus or something far stranger, the legend ensures one thing: it will always ride on, its destination unknown, waiting for its next passenger or its next believer. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it was always meant to be.